Welcome in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Hopefully you know Steve by now, but in case this is your first time joining us, Steve is a professor, a best-selling author. He's an internationally recognized expert in late talking children, also a late talker yourself. I want to say former late talker, but you...
No, I'm still got the late talker traits going strong.
Yep, I know. I've learned so much from you. That's really right. They never go away. So Steve, our late talker, is going to answer listener questions. Last week we answered some, so if you didn't hear yours, maybe it's here. Maybe it's today. We're going to start with a mom to a 4-year-old girl. She says that her daughter has a severe receptive delay, that they have definitely seen progress, but it's been really slow. So do you have any tips for her there?
So some late talkers understand as well as other children. Others, like my own late talking son, they have difficulty understanding what people say, and that's a receptive language disorder, also called a comprehension disorder. And it's very challenging because if you understand what people say, you can quickly then translate that to what you're saying in the output side, the expressive language side. But when you don't understand very well, you have to be very systematic and very incremental in supporting that. So the basic idea is that you want to establish a core vocabulary. If your child's having trouble understanding words, that's the first part you start with, is word understanding. Then you can do word combinations, word endings, and then longer sentences. It helps to pair it with visuals. So a lot of times you might show pictures. Let's say you're teaching verbs. We do recommend teaching understanding of verbs. We know that's very challenging, much more challenging than objects. Anyway, you'll show a picture with whatever activity you're demonstrating, and then you can write out the word underneath it or several words so the child has a visual support. That's very important. It is very slow. I know with my late talking son, it would take a lot of presentations for him to learn vocabulary and keep him in his long-term memory. So we had a really nice picture dictionary with photographs in it that was very realistic. And I'd go through a set. I picked 10 or 20 of those to work on in a week. We'd do them over and over again. And I'd show him the pictures, and then the very next day he would forget. And so I had to do the same set over and over again. So the other important thing is be strategic in what you're doing, but also be sure you're teaching them to mastery. Just because they can do it one day doesn't mean they're going to know it the next day. And so you want to practice that until they consistently know it, and then you just slowly but surely keep adding to that store. After a child gets to the point where they can understand like about a 5-year-old, then the comprehension goes much faster. But in the initial stages, it just takes a lot of time, and it really should be a high priority. It's probably the most important thing to be teaching at that point, even more so than the speaking part of it. Understanding is really important. If your child is a receptive disorder, really work on that. I'll also say that a lot of times there's packages with scripts and things like that. It's really important to be very practical and to teach words that the child is using in their everyday world, instead of some like package that comes in where there's a lot of esoteric words they don't encounter. It's better to teach the real words in the context.
When you say a package and scripts, you're talking about something actually physically from a speech path that comes.
Could be a speech path, could be something online. They'll say, okay, here's the vocabularies, a typical 3-year-old understands, and it may be characters in a book. It may be let me see if I can think of some examples. So that maybe they would work on something like cauliflower, okay, but maybe the child doesn't really see cauliflower. So it's not really important they learn that word in that moment. You want to think about, okay, what are the words that are in that? What are the objects and actions that are in that child's real world, everyday world? And so it's not about, oh, here's a list of vocabulary words that most 3-year-olds know. You wouldn't want to do that. You'd want to say, okay, what are the words that my child's seeing in their everyday life, and then how do I support the understanding of that?
Well, this same parent with that 4-year-old daughter says that her daughter scripts. So is that what you're talking about? She's reading through, or the parent is working with her with the script?
So scripting normally means that the child is repeating what other people say. They're doing a script, like an actor might do a script. And actors, of course, read it and then act it out. But it's a script would be where they're doing longer sentences where they wouldn't necessarily understand all the pieces of it. Scripting is actually fine. Some people are really worried about it and they think of it as bad, but actually what happens is the child may use a longer phrase or something in conversations. There might be a connection to it. As an example, let's say a child walks into the kitchen. Maybe they are familiar with that old TV series, Blue's Clues, and they walk in the kitchen and say, "Oh, here's Mr. Salt and Pepper," Mr. and Mrs. Salt and Pepper, which is a phrase in Blue's Clues. That script is actually good because they're connecting it to that environment, and they have something they're calling up that actually makes some sense. And so that scripting is fine. When a child uses a script like that, what you want to do then is just model it and say, "Oh, I'm in the kitchen now." Or you just, when they say it, don't try to correct it or get rid of it. Actually model a more typical kind of a response, but always build on the scripting. Don't like criticize it or worry about it.
The same parent wants to know, and maybe you can kind of help educate all of us, Gestalt language development, and they want to know your opinion about that. So can you help?
Yeah.
What is that?
Gestalt is a really big term. And if you're talking to most psychologists, they think of it so historically, people would, and they still do this, if someone's like having some psychological challenges, they might try to interview them about their childhood. Gestalt is basically living in the moment. Okay, so that kind of Gestalt psychology and psychotherapy is whatever happened before, what really matters is today and going forward. Okay, and so in our world, Gestalt means that you're using longer phrases. So in other words, children might learn in bigger chunks than just words and word endings and so on. It's fine. I think, we always want to meet children where they are. If they're using longer phrases, I think modeling them and breaking into them in the way I just suggested is really a good way to go. There are packages that are Gestalt learning. If they meet your child, fine. If not, then they're not really effective. Again, it's always what is your child learning now and how do you meet them where they are. I use Gestalt learning in a little different way, and this is actually related. So some children with receptive language disorder, when you give them a vocabulary test, they do relatively poorly. And then when you do grammatical morphology, which are the little bits of information at the ends of words that tell us things like past tense, plurals, and so on, they're really terrible at that. But when you give them longer sentences, their comprehension is better. And it's because they can use their thinking ability, their fluid reasoning to fill in the gaps. And so I think of Gestalt as actually giving them more information. They can bootstrap things like vocabulary and word endings. And that's how I use it. And I've been using it that way for a long time. But in the therapy world, it means using these long scripts as a practice platform. And again, if that's the way your child learns, fine. If they don't, then don't work them through it that way. And maybe they're like my late talking son, and they really need to do words and then word endings and word combinations in that order, which is really more common, to be honest with you. But Gestalt is something we should have in our toolkit.
There's a mom with a 3-year-old son who wants to ask if late talkers may also have some sensory issues that they grow out of as their speech comes in.
So the term sensory issues is not really well defined. So there's a kind of treatment that it used to be called sensory integration, and now it's called sensory processing, where clinicians, and it could be a speech path, usually it's an occupational therapist, and they think about the child's sensitivity to touch, their sensitivity to hearing, and their sensitivity to balance. So that's tactile, proprioceptive, and vestibular. And they think that if they do exercises like putting a weighted vest on the child, putting them in a balance swing or something like that, is a way to help them learn how to talk. So if there's challenges that the OT is concerned about in terms of fine motor, gross motor, and so on, they want to do that, I would absolutely defer to them. But this idea about sensory sensitivities, I recommend that you really, if your child, for example, is sensitive to touch or they're sensitive to sound, to just work with that in an individual way. It's not related to talking. And so really, if you want to help a child learn how to talk, teach them how to talk, you don't need to be doing putting them on a platform swing or things like that. That won't help them learn to talk. Again, if they have the sensitivity, fine, work on it. The example I like to use is there was a little guy with autism. Whenever the air conditioning would come on, he would get so upset he would actually tear holes in the drywall, so the family couldn't have the air conditioning on. Somebody with a sensory perspective put a weighted vest on him. They had him listen to this altered kind of input and so on. Didn't really help it. What I did is I recorded the air conditioning coming on and then I put it at a really low level he liked a certain video game. I put that in the background so that what was a distressing sound then became a pleasurable sound. And, that went away. So you can desensitize them to things like that. So I really recommend desensitization if that problem comes up, but it's not directly related to the talking part. Yeah.
So all late talkers don't also have sensory
No,
issues.
not at all. Many do have preferences and so on. Many don't. I had one mom say, will my late talking child, walk outside in the grass, And I'm like, well, that's really not high on my priority, but yeah, he will. And he ended up, being a surfer and going on the beach and stuff. And she kind of laughed that she was worried about that at one point. I do want to kind of put a bow around the that parent that I talked about where the kid would tear the drywall, holes in the drywall. I still see that family from time to time, and they always say, thank you so much for letting us have air conditioning on in our home in Nashville in the summertime. And we did help that child learn to talk as well, but they're really happy he could be in the house in the summer, and that's a high priority. We want to think about that as well. So we do want to handle those sensitivities, those sensory sensitivities, if you will, but they're separate from the speech and language issues.
So like that child that you help with the sensory issues, would you say they outgrew those, or did they just find a way to adapt?
Many children do outgrow them, but for something like that where the reactions are extreme, then you actually want to use an intervention plan to help desensitize them to that. The other thing that kind of cracks me up sometimes, and I don't mean to be irreverent, but sometimes they'll take a late talker who's pretty clean, and they really do have an aversion to messy substances, and they'll put their hands in shaving cream or rice or beans, and the idea of making them more messy. And in my world, I don't want to make kids more messy, But anyway, if you put their hands in shaving cream or beans and rice, it won't help them talk better. And so you can kind of think of it that way. If you really want them to be sensitive to that, then go ahead and do it, but it's separate from talking.
We have a question from a dad. Child's about 3 years old. They read your book.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you so much.
Symptom or a stage. And, I think it was something, too, that my takeaway was it's hard to say whether this is going to be a symptom or a stage, right? And that kind of key time frame, 18 to 36 months. So this is kind of where this dad's perspective is coming from. So trying to put this here into a question form for you. So how can you, first of all, I know this is a lot to digest, sorry. So how can we help this parent understand whether their child is making progress on their own or if it was, in fact, just the stage that they passed through?
Okay, so the first thing is when a child comes in who's late talking, we want to do some parent coaching and some things that we know accelerate speech and language development. Whether it's a stage or a symptom, that's beneficial. And so there was one little girl who's now a teenager, but she was a late talker. I thought that, it was going to be a stage rather than a symptom. I did some parent coaching. I checked in with them every month to see the growth. And actually after she hit about 3 years of age, she had this massive burst and went from being a late talker to actually being advanced in her speech and language. And actually, when I saw the parent later on, when the young woman was a teenager, she was talking on her cell phone a lot, and her mom was saying, can you kind of put it back a little bit? She talks so much now. But as far as what's actually causing the change, there's actually scientific ways of knowing that. But I'm very kind of pragmatic about it. I don't, in a way, I'm going to do the enrichment. I'm going to see if that is effective. If not, I'm going to keep adding support until we can move the child forward. And we do have good intervention studies to know what does help and what doesn't. But in the end, I just want to help them learn to talk. And so whether it would happen just naturally and spontaneously or whether the treatment really caused the change, I'm very interested in that, and I write articles on that. But really, the main thing is I'm thinking, okay, great, this kid's making progress, and that's what I care about. We do expect certain kinds of progress depending on the child's profile. If we don't see that, that means we need to change it up and add support and tinker with the support if they're not making the progress we expect. There are certainly times when I say, okay, in the next 6 months, I expect, these kinds of things to happen. I check in with the parents 6 months later. They say they're not happening. Then I'm like, okay, we need to do these additional things. We need to do this differently. And so we're constantly doing what we call dynamic assessment to figure out how to optimize the intervention for that child.
You talk about changing up the support. You
Yes.
mean adding more people or just adding new therapies? Or?
Any or all the above. And so we if you have this developmental framework and you know the kind of the interventions that work, it's also important to have different things in your toolkit. And you're saying, well, my best guess is this is going to happen in the next 6 months based on the literature. Gosh, it didn't happen. Here's some additional time we're going to put in. Maybe we're going to change up how we do our intervention. Maybe we would, add some activities, whatever it is. So we're going to try to do the detective work, and we're always going to be charting that progress to know what's happening and if it's really meeting our expectations. That's true whether it's a symptom or a stage.
This parent had a lot to digest for me over here in terms of breaking down the comment. So expanding on what he had to say, how can you reliably diagnose in a 2 to 3 year old if there's so many clues, and you and I talked about this at great length. So I understand the frustration of where this person might be coming from. Is that right? Because a 2 and 3 year old, they're stubborn, they're obstinate, they may not want to cooperate, right? So how do we know if that's late talking or just personality traits? So just kind of touch upon that again for this parent out there.
That's a really good question. And so basically what's really important is that the person doing the assessment has to have the experience and knowledge with regard to the kind of the normal range of behavior. So all 2-year-olds throws tantrums, but in a late talker, for example, who has autism or who has oppositional defiance, there's going to be qualitative and quantitative differences in the magnitude and frequency of those tantrums, and they're going to occur in different circumstances. So maybe a common sense example would be for a reliance on routines. Most children actually line up their toys, and that's fine. It's not a symptom of anything. So if the child's late talking, they're line up their toys, don't push the panic button. If a child really has challenges, what happens is when they line up their toys, they do it the same way every time, and then if you change the order of the toys, they have a meltdown. That's the difference I'm talking about. So you have normal variation in how the behavior happens, but if you're a skilled clinician, you can look for differences. And the clinician should be saying, yes, your child is having tantrums, other 2-year-olds have tantrums. Here's why I think your child maybe is doing something that's different that we don't necessarily see in other 2-year-olds. And they should really be very thoughtful and mindful about that.
And even if they're showing differences, that doesn't necessarily always mean that they're going to get some sort of diagnosis from that.
No, that's right. And I think the key thing here really is to say, so a lot of times a late talker, people will assess a late talker and they're just saying, okay, I'm going to find out that there's something, their goal is to find something wrong. The goal is to say, this late talking absolutely is a symptom. We know that for more than half of them, it's going to be a stage. And so don't make any assumptions. Don't assume yours is a stage, not a symptom. But, the reality is that people should be looking for that and being open-minded to what the late talking can be. It's not always going to be autism. It's not always going to be a stage. You really need somebody who's going to look at that child as an individual and has the experience to know, hey, these are the things that say to me, this is just going to be a passing stage. I'm going to do enrichment anyway because there's no downside to it. I'm going to do parent coaching, just general enrichment. Or, gosh, I think this is a symptom. I think it's a symptom of X, Y, and Z. Here's where I'm going to come in and intervene. And by the way, if your child has late talking, that's a kind of a symptom, that clinician should know how it unfolds. And they're going to be able to say, oh, gosh, this child really is getting better in ways that I wasn't anticipating. Maybe it was a stage. That's okay. You want to be open-minded to it.
Well, that's kind of where my mind started to go when you're talking about this. So if you're a parent of a child who is late talking and might be having some other symptoms, mm-hmm. and then you go a couple years and then everything kind of just starts to move forward. The child's talking, the behaviors change. A parent might stop and say, oh, I wasted all that time.
Yeah. Again, I'm always focused on, what's the outcome and how we got to the outcome I'm happy with. Now, there are things that happen. So again, you figure that half or more than half it's only going to be a stage. They're going to catch up and, that's the journey that the parents are going to be on. I had one late talker come in at 3. Mom was a nurse. A physician, a pediatrician, a developmental pediatrician, and me all said, oh, We think this is a stage. He's going to be better in about a year. He's going to catch up in many ways, in a year and a half. And mom kind of pushed the panic button. She went to this alternative medicine place where they're giving him kind of these pretty heavy duty drugs to basically get toxins out of his system, and she wrote, I saw lead pour out of my child and so on. And, that Dr. Camarata is so-and-so, he denied, the challenges in my child. And within a year, he had this burst. And so she did all this treatment. I'm really happy that the child ended up as I thought he would, that he, but she has a superstitious belief in this stuff. We now know from lots of studies that chelation and this idea of the lead toxicity as a story is not necessarily one that's scientifically based, but she has a belief in it. And so I do want to caution people from just doing everything, because some things actually, like that chelation part, it's basically a chemical thing to take heavy metals out of your body. So like, let's say your child does get exposed to lead through paint or something like that. They may give you some medicine, and this is what physicians do, it's not me, but that'll get the lead out of their blood at least temporarily. And so there is a real medical thing, but most late talkers, that's not an issue. So you want to kind of follow standard medical practice. The reason I'm saying it is that a lot of times when a child gets better, you just don't know what it is. And that's really in this situation where she actually was thinking that particular quack treatment was what was doing it, when in fact, really, he was probably going to get better on his own as long as she didn't do anything to derail his development. And luckily, he didn't get sick from the chelation, which sometimes kids do.
Really?
So, yeah, there's been some deaths from it. You just want to really not go that way. Yeah.
We do have a couple more to go through. We're going to answer some more questions here. So, a mom to a 4-year-old girl was wondering if you could please discuss what options can we ask for providers if their child isn't sitting still, or I should say teachers, right? Not necessarily providers. So what advice do you have from this question? It sounds like if a child can't sit still, what advice for those teachers that this parent can pass along? What advice for the parent to help their child sit still? If language is,
That's a really important question. So what you want to know is if the child can sit still under what we call optimal conditions, or if it's a general problem with sitting still. Now, what I mean by that is you watch the late talker and you see if when they're in a preferred activity, if they can inhibit movement. And so the way we actually kind of differentially diagnose this is you figure out something they're really interested in, and do they have to get up and move very regularly, and you actually can time that. Or is it the case that you're putting the child in a situation where it doesn't fit in with their learning? They're fine with movement or attention unless you put them in a condition where they aren't really very good at it. So the example I like to use is, let's say I took you, and I'm assuming you don't speak Spanish, and I put you in a... Okay, well, very good. A bad assumption, chauvinistic assumption on my part, sorry. Okay. Anyway, so... should I use Korean? You pick a language, all right? So if I put you in a preschool classroom in Korean, you're going to fidget. As much as you're sitting here nicely and putting up with my nonsense, if I put you in a situation where you don't understand what's being said, you are going to have the wiggles. And so you want to think about if the context is causing the movement, or if it's actually that the child has a problem with limiting an impulse to move.
She said that her daughter does well when she's focused on an activity at a table. It's circle time, and when they're transitioning, and she's not quite ready to transition.
No, exactly. And so that's what you want to think about. Is this a byproduct of compliance demands, or is it really that the child has a problem with inhibiting the impulse to move? Those are very different things. And honestly, if it's that she doesn't want to sit in circle time, but she can focus other times, I would just wait on the circle time. And it's not circle time, as much as people emphasize it, it's not essential for learning. Children do it, great. I really recommend that teachers make circle time optional, But anyway, I understand schools have their routines and they're trying to get children to comply with them. But if that's the only time the child is having trouble, I wouldn't think of that as being a problem with attention and activity level.
Is there anything this mom can do to help her daughter understand how to do that in the classroom, or is it sort of a lost cause?
Yeah, I just think I just don't think it's worth putting a lot of effort into. There's other things probably if she's a late talker that we want to be working on, and sitting still and listen is never going to be a strong suit for any late talker. So, I wouldn't necessarily hit that one hard. I think what I try to do is negotiate with the classroom and say, look, here are some things we can do for that child. They can maybe be doing something else. Maybe they could have like a little activity that they enjoy or something, as long as they're close to circle time and not disrupting their children. I try to accommodate that so they can be in the routine of the classroom. But many times, the children, many late talkers don't do well in circle time. One of my little favorite vignettes is one of my good friends was a chair of speech pathology at Massachusetts General Hospital, so really a high-powered person, and he never had circle time. And so in his talks, he would always say, because kindergarten wasn't mandatory when he was going through, so he went right into first grade and never had kindergarten. And so he'd say, think of how much I could have achieved if I had the opportunity to do circle time in kindergarten or preschool. So sometimes we overvalue things like that. And it's something I really don't want to force a child to do, because it's going to teach them that the school is not necessarily a good place to be. Again, it's like putting you in that Korean circle time for a lot of the late talkers, particularly the ones with receptive language disorders. So I just try to negotiate a solution, and then by the late talker time, until the circle time is no longer part of the routine, it's not worth the effort to try to force them to do it.
Thank you for answering all of those questions. Next week, we're going to talk about behavior management and discipline. So be sure to join us right here next week for that. In the meantime, if you have more questions, if you would like to leave a comment, Steve actually looks at them all. So does Mary. So please check them out, and we will be happy to help answer those questions. And also click subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and hit the bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And remember, the best thing for your child is you.